So after a quick hot cocoa break, I'm back around the campfire to bring you the next chapters of my book Moxie Roses, which is book 1 of the Thunder Rose collection. If you missed the previous chapters, they are linked down below in the show notes and video description for you. Without further ado, let us move forward. I like when I did this in the first recording, because even though it's tapping on a book, it made me think of horses. My Thunder Rose horses, my friends. Let's get into chapter 5. Edgar returns. As the campout was occurring in the pasture, Pamela was in the main house living area, spooked by the screams that she heard in the night. Never had they come so close together or so sinister sounding. She remembered back to her childhood when she had first heard them. She was a small girl, and she'd been left alone by her father when he went to get some hay for the horses in the barn. She'd been in the bedroom looking out the window after him as he moved about in the lamplight at the barn's door. She had opened her window to catch a glimpse of the stars, and when she had put her head out to see the moon, a scream had pierced the night air. As a small child, her first inclination was to run and hide under her bed, but after several minutes under there in the dark, she began to doubt that she had heard anything at all. The Cartwright Ranch had been several towns away from where Thunder Rose was now, but they shared the same forest between them. Young Pamela had crawled out from under her bed and back to the window. Her father was nowhere to be seen, and the lamp in the barn was off now, with only the moon and stars to light up the surrounding area. "Daddy, are you there?" she said timidly out the window. "Daddy, I'm scared." Just then her bedroom door opened, and her father walked in and swept her up in his arms. "Did you hear that crazy sound, Pam?" he said, trying to console her now as the tears fell. "The horses were pretty spooked, but whatever it is gone now. You can stop crying," he said, brushing away her tears. "Daddy, what was it?" she asked, not really sure if she wanted to know. "Well, those old stories around about this forest being haunted, but there's nothing for a little girl to be concerned about, and you're safe here at home with me, and nothing can harm you here," he said gently. "Why don't I sleep in your room tonight, just to prove that everything's going to be okay?" he asked. "I'm fine, Daddy," she said, wiping away her tears. "I'm not a little girl anymore. I'm almost 10 years old, and that's pretty much a grown-up," she said, convinced that it was. "Plus, I have beauty school tomorrow, and I don't want to be kept awake by your snoring," she said, giggling as he tickled her nose. "Okay, we'll get some sleep then. Mandy will take you to school in the morning, and I'm going out of town to meet the Sioux tribe leader up in the north. We're doing some land planning," he said, matter-of-factly, although he knew that land planning with any tribal leader was a serious deal. Pamela was jolted out of her memory by the second scream. "Darn it, the horses," she thought, jumping up. "They must be upset by now." She thought about how Onyx had reacted earlier, and she knew she needed to get out there. She made her way to the back door and pulled on her mucking boots and a warm jacket. She made sure her pockets were filled with small apples and her bottle of lavender essential oil that she used to dab under their muzzles if there was a horse that needed extra comforting. The memory of the screams heard as a little girl faded from her as she made her way down the back path to the stables. She wondered how long it would take for Edgar to get there and help figure out what was going on. She was losing sleep over this, and it made dark circles under her eyes that were getting harder to cover up. As luck would have it, Edgar had received her message, and after a few minutes of tuning into the guidance of his helping spirits, he knew that a horse ride would take too long. He had never done this before, and he questioned his sanity as he decided to take his old truck down to Texas instead. The drive would take him about 4 hours, rather than the week or so it would take for the horse to make it. He also had a feeling he would need all his wits about him in order to focus on what was happening at the ranch. He had packed his saddlebags and called his good friend Bear to take care of the horses. He figured he'd be gone for a few weeks, but with winter being so close, he knew he might not make it back before February, so he packed accordingly. He made it a point to take his medicine bag that he only used for high ceremony, thinking that there would be a need for the sacred tools inside if what he thought was happening at Thunder Rose was what he thought it was. He dumped the bags into the back of the truck and prepared for the long ride by grabbing some of his homemade jerky, his pipe, and flask on the way out the door. As Pamela reached the stable door, she could hear the horses inside. She wondered why Diego and the girls hadn't come up to check and figured they were having too much fun to notice. Well, at least she hoped they were, and that Moxie and Diego hadn't shacked up somewhere, leaving poor Amber by herself. She thought she might walk out to the pasture to spy a little, but decided against it, knowing that if Amber got slighted, she would be the first to hear about it. She slowly opened the stable doors, the sound of whinnying and moving about. "Shh, it's okay," she said, walking in and turning on another lantern. There was nothing happening in here that looked out of the ordinary, so she went to each stall, as was her usual custom, and talked to each horse, lovingly petting them on the top of their muzzle. Each one greeted her as an old friend visiting, and she took comfort in their presence as she had since she was a young girl. "It's okay, Onyx," she said, approaching the black horse as he reared up in his stall. He was always so sensitive, she thought. He'd had a rough life before she purchased him at a local auction. She didn't know the whole history, but she knew it wasn't good. She had done everything she could to make him feel comfortable and at home here at Thunder Rose, but she knew that sometimes these things take time. It didn't help that lately there was this horrible screaming and otherworldly goings-on here. It made the poor boy extra nervous, and there was nothing she could do now to change anything about that. If only Diego would get here soon, she kept saying to herself, confident that he could help. Diego? What am I talking about? If only Edgar would get here soon. She kept saying to herself, confident that he could help. She dabbed a small dot of lavender oil on Onyx's nose and decided that things were pretty much under control in the stables, so she decided to walk up towards the pasture to check on the slumber party just in case. As she neared the tents, placed in a small circle in the middle of the pasture, the glow of a light coming from inside the trees caught her attention. Pamela never went into the woods by herself, and had warned Amber not to travel any further than the first row of trees. However, she knew she couldn't control the curiosity of young girls. She thought maybe Diego was messing around in there trying to follow the screams, and she didn't want him to get hurt on her property. Her insurance on the place was high enough as it was. She continued to move towards the glowing light, and then she could hear something that sounded like chanting, and her imagination got the better of her. Holy hell, she thought, what has been going on around here? And now this sound that she had never heard before. But it didn't sound evil, she thought, moving closer. It actually sounded comforting. And it drew her even closer as she stepped into and beyond the first row of trees, being drawn ever closer to the glow. She was holding her breath now, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead despite the chilly night air. What was drawing her here, and what was she going to see? She couldn't fathom it in her mind as she moved into the thicker trees now. She heard a deep, low voice chanting more clearly. "Humusatke bu no tankasu," is what it sounded like to her as she listened intently. She hoped it wasn't some displaced person who had decided to take up residence in her woods, as she liked to think of them. It wasn't that she disliked transients, it was just they could be unpredictable, and had in the past walked up to the main house to ask for food, startling poor Marguerite, who had eventually given in and made them something to eat. Pamela could hear the chanting so closely now she was afraid to show herself to whoever it was, so she huddled behind a large pine and strained her eyes in the dark to see what was happening. And then she saw it, a figure moving around a small fire. The figure was a man, and he was chanting and throwing something on the fire and waving a stick around in the air. The fire leapt up suddenly and cast a better light on the whole scene, and in that moment Pamela drew in a deep breath of relief and joy. "Edgar!" she almost screamed, stepping out from behind the trees to run to him. "Little Pam, I thought I heard you back there," he said, as if he had known all along that it was her. But how could he have known that, Pamela thought to herself, as he scooped her up, letting out a hoot-holler and setting her back down on her feet. "Girl, you are looking good as ever," he said, not trying to put too much enthusiasm into it, knowing her propensity to over-exaggerate on her looks. "Oh, Edgar, I'm so glad you've come," she said, clearly relieved. "You can't imagine what's been going on around here. I just had to make that urgent call to you. I don't know what else to do," she said, looking into his eyes with her big blue doe eyes that were starting to show the lines of wisdom and past pains. "I know all about what's happening here, but you wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said, looking up into the dark night sky. "You'll have to wait and see it all for yourself, and then you'll believe. You'll need strength and patience, but you can do it, Pam," he said, looking at her more deeply now. For as much as he tried to fool himself into believing there was nothing between them, he also knew that every time he looked into her eyes, he was seeing something magical in there. He couldn't wait until the magic was revealed, and he knew that it would happen this winter before he had to return home. His spirit guides had revealed the whole story to him as he sat around the fire this night, and it had already begun to take place. The revealing, as he was being told that it was to be called, was already happening. A young girl had just seen something here last night, and the energy was starting to build around that sacred vision. It wouldn't be long now, but he knew it also meant he had a lot of work to do. He must prepare himself for what was going to occur. "Come up to the main house tonight," Pamela said, almost pleading with him. She wanted him close by, laying next to her in her bed if she could have her way. She breathed softly as she watched his reaction to her request. She could feel his heat next to her, and she longed to have him hold her close. It had been so long since anyone had truly cared for her, and she was empty inside, and the longing of it often drew her into deep despair. It was those times that she would lose herself in the horses and their sensitivity and knowing, for they had always brought her comfort. "I've much to do here," he said, a little too sternly, and to her disappointment. "I'll sleep out here tonight." But it's freezing out," she said, knowing that wouldn't matter. But once he had made up his mind, there was no changing it. "Well, at least let me bring you some food and blankets," she said, touching his arm. "Yes, thank you," he said, turning back to the fire and to his chanting again. She retraced her footsteps back towards the first line of trees and out onto the pasture again. Walking towards the 3 tents, she wondered what Edgar had meant about a girl seeing a sacred vision. She decided to pop in on Amber and see if she was okay. She loved her daughter dearly, even if at times her actions proved otherwise. Amber was her only child, and often reminded her of Quint and his hateful ways. Sometimes Amber could be very difficult, she thought, nearing the tents. She didn't know which one was Amber, so she had to peek into each one of them. On the first try, she looked in to see Diego sleeping peacefully, covered up to his face in the deep warmth of the sleeping bag. She was tempted to look further in, but decided against it. She loved to be around young men's energy. It made her feel alive inside. The second tent was Moxie's, and as she looked in, she gasped. The young girl was sprawled out on the ground inside, with her hand touching something that Pamela couldn't quite make out in the dark. "Oh, heavens," she muttered aloud as she knelt down next to Moxie. "Well, at least she's alive." She breathed a sigh of relief, feeling Moxie's breath on her hand. "Moxie, it's me, Pamela, Amber's mother. Can you hear me?" As she waited for the girl to come to, she ran back to Diego's tent to wake him. "Diego, wake up! It's Moxie! Come quick!" she said, shaking his shoulder and then leaving him to rise as she went back to Moxie. Moxie was just starting to stir, and Pamela found her sitting upright, shaking her head from side to side, trying to push away the cobwebs of reality. "Moxie, you're safe. Can you hear me?" she said, kneeling down next to her now. I don't know what happened to me," Moxie said, shivering. "I was trying to open this box," she said, reaching around on the ground, but the box was nowhere to be found again. "Maybe it was all a dream," she said, trailing off. "Girl, you're going to freeze yourself to death. I don't know how long you've been down there, but you're going to catch a cold in this weather. We need to get you back up to the main house," Pamela said. "Can you stand up, hon?" By then, Diego had entered into the tent, and seeing Moxie on the floor, he went into chivalry mode, bending down to pick her up in his arms as if she were a small animal needing care. Moxie was exhausted yet exhilarated at the same time, if that was even possible. Something was happening to her, and it was beyond her control. She lay against Diego and let him move her out of the tent. He wasn't letting go as Pamela covered her in a blanket, and he made his way back to the path leading to the main house. "I don't know what's happening to me," she said, with her head resting on his shoulder. "It's going to be okay, darling," he said, knowing this wasn't the right time either. Darn it, he thought, every time he had her close was never the right time. Pamela stayed behind to rouse Amber and found her deep in dreamland, cuddled up in her sleeping bag. She almost didn't want to wake her, but she couldn't let her sleep out here after what was happening. And as she went to shake her awake, the magnum condom dropped to the floor. Picking it up, Pamela realized she had much more to be concerned about than what she had thought. Chapter 6, The Revealing. Out in the woods, Edgar worked on casting a circle of light around this sacred space. He knew it would take all his energy and knowingness to work this magic here. It wasn't so much that he had to do anything, really. He simply needed to hold the space and let the energy of the spirits come through. This revealing had been waiting to take place for many years now, and the culmination of it made his heart sing. It was finally time for big changes in the world, and a few ragtag people on a ranch were going to be the ones to usher the changes in. He hummed to himself and lit a small sage bundle from his medicine bag, waving the smoke around the space where he would make his camp. This was not the center of all the activity, but he was very close to it. There were still so many things he didn't understand, but he knew the knowledge of it all would come in time. He had parked the old truck on the outskirts of the wood off the main road, but outside the ranch. He hadn't wanted to wake anyone, but it looked like everyone was awake now. Too much energy flowing around here, he thought to himself. He wanted badly to talk to the girl, but he calmed himself and decided to wait until the morning. Rolling out his sleeping bag close to the fire, he pulled out the jerky and his flask. Lighting his pipe, he took several long drags, letting the smoke envelop his entire being. This was no ordinary tobacco, and he didn't smoke it for pleasure. It was grown by a good friend for use in ritual, and he figured this was a ritual that called for all his tools. What was the revealing, actually? He silently prayed for clarity and direction. What he got was that something big was coming, and he was needed here. That was all they were going to tell him for now, and he would have to be satisfied with a piece of jerky and took a big swig out of the flask, letting the liquor warm his body. Pamela would be back soon, and he would need to answer more questions. Questions he himself didn't have answers to yet. He figured something would come in his dream time, so he was anxious to go to sleep. And just as he was drifting off, he heard a crackle of feet on pine needles moving towards him. Pamela appeared, carrying a thick blanket and basket of what he guessed was dinner. "We've got some drama up at the house," she said, laying the items down next to him. He graciously accepted them, digging into the basket and realizing he was more hungry than he thought, as the scent of maple pie and smoked ham sandwiches brushed against his nose. Yeah, what happened?" he said, intrigued. "I found Moxie, Diego's friend, unconscious in her tent," she said, concerned. "She didn't know how she got there, and she kept talking about some box. We couldn't find it anywhere." "Well, that is interesting now," he said, taking a bite out of one of the sandwiches. "This box must hold the key to something," he said, trying to understand how it fit into the bigger picture. "Did she say what it looked like?" he asked. "Diego said it was a small, square wooden box with a brass cross on the lid. That's it," he said, recounting what Amber and Diego had told her while she was packing the picnic basket. "I still don't understand what caused Moxie to pass out. I hope she's not pregnant," Pamela said, her mind trailing off to the distant past when she had first learned of Amber's existence in her womb. She had literally fainted from fear of the unknown and had vowed this would be her only child, and so it had been. "I must get some rest now," he said, hoping she would get the picture as he finished off the first sandwich. "Thank you, Pam. I'll come up to talk to you more in the morning," he said, rising. He's not completely without gentlemanly qualities, she thought, as he stood in front of her. She didn't know if she should kiss him, hug him, or just walk away. So she settled on the latter, letting him linger on her form, which was still seductive, even in her loungewear and heavy coat. She heard him chuckle as she walked away. She made her way back to the main house more quickly now, and she had many questions that needed to be answered, and not a lot of time before her patience with the whole matter would start to wear out. Edgar knew there was nothing in the forest to fear, although the spirits here were very restless, he thought, zipping up in his sleeping bag. He knew that the loud screeches and blood-curdling screams were no joke, and that someone or something was trying to stop the revealing from happening here. But who or what was not clear yet, and he mulled it over and over in his mind as he drifted off into a deep sleep. Back at the house, Pamela sat on her bed, preparing to talk to Amber, but she wasn't quite sure what she needed to say yet. And she mulled it over and over in her mind as she drifted off into a deep sleep. Down in the den area, Moxie and Diego sat on the leather sofa in front of the fire as Amber made hot cocoa in the kitchen. It was one of the few things she could prepare on her own, and she thought she did a pretty good job of it, filling the thick clay mugs with organic cacao and warm almond milk and topping with a handful of mini marshmallows. She put everything on a tray and stopped to check her reflection in the guest bathroom mirror. There was still a chance, she thought to herself as she reached into her pocket to make sure the Magnum was still there. She didn't know her mother had seen it, and she felt excited again to think her dream might still come true tonight. Moxie was still fuzzy, trying to piece together what had happened in her tent. Once she had fainted, she had entered into a deep trance state unbeknownst to her. There in that state the Divine Mother had come to her again and laid out the entire plan before her. Everything that Moxie would be required to do for her part in the revealing. She had no conscious recollection of any of this now, as the plan had been ingrained in her subconscious and would only be revealed when the time to execute on it was near. Diego was trying to be as supportive as possible, but that didn't come as easy as he thought. He had no idea what to say or do with something like this, and attributed that to his lack of upbringing by any persistent female figure. The compassion and delicate touch that a mother's love could bring to a child were foreign to him. He had been brought up by his grandfather and uncles, and the words "brought up" were being used loosely. His mother had dropped him off at the fire station in New Mexico and was never to be seen again when he was a year old. His paternal grandfather, Emilio, had learned of the incident through a friend who had read about it in the paper. He made the decision to take Diego in, as that's what kin did, but beyond that he wasn't much of a role model, as his lust for women and money took up much of his time and efforts. Baby Diego was often left with neighbors or at the church daycare so Emilio could play the horses during the day. At night he was left alone in his room when Emilio went out on a date with his latest fling. Diego learned about women from Emilio's collection of penthouse magazines and by the church nuns who took care of him, both unrealistic examples of a modern-day woman. "I don't really remember anything," Moxie said, looking into the fire. "Just that I was able to get the lid off that box, and then that's it. The next thing I remember was Pamela calling out to me, and then you picking me up," she said, resting her head on his shoulder now. "And that box is nowhere to be found again. It's so strange," she said, her voice trailing off. "You might remember more after a good night's sleep," he said, brushing her hair back with his hand. He could feel her breath now on his cheek, and her face was so close to his. He started to move into her, and as their lips almost touched, Amber bounced into the room with the cocoa. "What are y'all doing?" she said, knowing full well what was happening on that couch. She was no fool, and her timing had been perfect. "Moxie, you won't win," she thought to herself as she set down the tray in front of them. "Moxie, you've been through so much tonight. Why don't you use my bedroom?" she said, hoping that would be enough of a catalyst to get Moxie moving so she could have Diego all to herself. "I can keep Diego company while you rest." Moxie really was exhausted, and in more ways than just this incident. She had been trying for a while now to break herself free from Diamond and the Pink Lady. She wanted to be a respectable girl that men didn't drool over as she flashed her breasts in their face. She had been secretly taking classes during the day to get her degree in animal care and wanted to be a veterinary assistant for horses, so of course she had jumped at the opportunity to come to the ranch and spend time with them. But the toll of working almost non-stop on school and at the club was wearing her out. She had almost decided on giving up on her dream until she had gone into the stables. But now the weird happenings of the day clouded her consciousness, and she didn't know what was happening. "Yes, I think I'll turn in," she said, rising from the sofa. She took her mug of cocoa and looked at Amber, too tired to figure out what might happen next between her and Diego. "My room's the third one to the right at the top of the stairs," Amber said excitedly. "Good night, Moxie," she said, reaching out to give her a small peck on the cheek. "Good night, guys," Moxie said, as Diego rose to try to help her along, but she was already moving out of the room, and he realized he was all alone now with Amber. At the realization that she was now alone with Diego, Amber had no idea what she was supposed to do next. Her mother had been no help whatsoever in the sex department, and Amber learned about sex as most young girls did, from the silly sex ed class in school, and from all her friends who had been shacking up with boys since they were early in their teens. How Amber had escaped a sexual relationship yet was beyond her. She thought she did a pretty good job of showing guys that she was interested, and all her friends had told her what guys liked, and she had tried to implement some of these ideas without her mother finding out. But she must be doing something wrong, she thought to herself, but not tonight. She was going to reveal herself to Diego, and as her friends had told her, he wouldn't be able to say no to her. What she didn't realize is that Diego looked at mostly naked women almost every night and had become somewhat numb to the sight. He had to be, or else he would never make it out of the club's bathroom to do his work. He couldn't spend all night masturbating if he was going to keep his job. So he had learned a technique that a friend had taught him on how to calm and center his mind in the midst of any type of chaos. And he had implemented this centering technique wherever women were concerned. That was every woman except for Moxie. He just couldn't seem to center himself around her. Her presence made him crazy, even though on the outside he played it off pretty well. Diego could hear Amber talking to him, but his mind had been lost on Moxie. He wasn't prepared for what had happened next. "And I know that deep down you really like me, Diego," she said, standing up from where she sat next to him. "And I'm going to prove to you just how much I really like you, too," she said, as his mind came back into the room, and in what seemed like a fast-motion video, she had peeled off her top and bra, shimmied out of her sweatpants and underwear, and was standing completely naked in front of him, holding the magnum in one hand, praying he would say something, or at least take her into his arms and lay her down in front of the fireplace. Well, he was fully awake now, and couldn't help but admire what was clearly one of the finest bodies he had seen in a while. However, that was beside the point. Breathing in deeply, focusing his mind on being centered, he jumped up off the sofa, pulling the blanket that lay there up and around Amber. "Girl, are you crazy?" he said. "Your mom will have me fired in a minute if she catches us like this. What are you doing?" "I just want you to like me, maybe even love me. Heck, you don't even have to love me like that. We could just make love, you know." She stood there, her bottom lip trembling now. He softened a little and almost felt sorry for her parading herself like this. Although he really liked what he saw, she was no Moxie, and he realized he was falling hard for that girl upstairs. I gotta go, Amber. I'm gonna sleep in the gatehouse tonight. Please get dressed and go get some rest," he said, heading quickly out of the room as Amber burst into tears. "But Diego, you're supposed to make love to me," she screamed after him as the back screen door closed behind him. Chapter 7, Morning After. Edgar awoke to the sweet birdsong of the forest, while Pamela sat bolt upright in her bed, awakened from a terrible dream. She recalled that someone was trying to chase her through Thunder Rose Forest, but she could never make out who it was. Amber had retreated to the guest bedroom, knowing that she didn't want to wake Moxie and have to talk about that evening. She had slowly dressed herself last night, sobbing the whole time that she was going to become an old hag that no one ever wanted to make love to. Her mood wasn't any better in the morning, and her dark circles and unkempt hair made her seem older than her 19 years. Moxie awoke refreshed but smothered in Amber's bed by all the stuffed animals in the thick duvet. When she looked up at the ceiling, she saw a poster of the latest pop band cover boy, and that was enough to make her get up and dress herself. Edgar had already started a small fire and was shaking off the chill by doing a sun warrior's dance as he watched the morning sunrise through the trees. Something caught his attention, and he put his deer horn antler down to move closer to it. He could see a burst of light through the trees that looked brighter than sunlight. He crouched down behind a young pine to get a better view, and then he saw him, a luminescent figure floating above the tree line, with arms out and standing in receptive mode. Edgar stood to behold what was floating above him. It was masculine in appearance, wearing a long white robe and holding a candle in one etheric hand. Edgar dropped to his knees in reverence and awe at the spirit before him. His holy father god had sent a messenger, he thought, giving thanks to the spirits of the heavens. The apparition moved slowly amongst the trees and then stopped about 30 yards away. Edgar kept moving to follow and stopped in his tracks when he saw where the ghostly figure was directing him. A vast area of cleared pine needles lay out before him, untouched by any human in quite a while, it seemed. This was an untraveled part of the wood, and there was something that he needed to see sticking up out of the earth. He held his breath as he moved closer to it, and then bent down. The wooden box with a brass cross on the lid almost lifted itself into his hands. He was transfixed. As he let out his breath, was this the same box that Pam had spoke of, he thought to himself. Surely it couldn't have made its way from the pasture to this location. That is, unless someone had brought it here. But how could they have known to get him here to see it? He wasn't clear on that, and he wasn't getting any intuitive hits about it at the moment. He picked up the box and turned it over and around in his hands. He could feel an immense pull to want to pry off the cover and look inside, but he dissuaded himself from doing so. The box almost jumped in his hands as he set it back down on the ground, not really knowing what to do with it. He decided to leave it in case this was some sort of trap left by some malevolent being, although he didn't quite think so. If this was indeed the same box, then it was making its rounds around the ranch with some sort of purpose in mind, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. Pamela took a long, hot shower and dressed for the purpose of getting Edgar's attention, if nothing else. Her long blonde hair tied back in a leather clasp, and her tightest jeans with a bolero top, and her high Justin boots, she thought she looked elegant but not too flashy for a day on the ranch. Marguerite was already down in the kitchen making breakfast. She hadn't stayed at the ranch after the last scary experience with the gatehouse, but instead chose to drive from her home about 20 miles away early every morning to make breakfast. Then she stayed and prepared a light lunch and a heavier dinner that the Cartwright ladies just needed to heat up in order to have what they needed. Marguerite didn't like to stay after dark, and with the winter months closing in, she usually left around 4 p.m. each day. Today she had prepared extra treats, knowing that Edgar had arrived. He was by far one of the more favored people around here, in her opinion. There was never any drama about him, and you always got exactly what you needed in terms of his advice and interaction. Yes, Mr. Edgar was her favorite, and she wished he would stay here year-round. Breakfast consisted of freshly baked bagels and fresh cream butter for Edgar, and vegan treats for the girls. She wasn't sure about Moxie, and Diego would eat just about anything. So she was sure that in the huge spread laid out on the kitchen counter, that there was something for everyone. Edgar dropped his attention from the box to focus on getting up to the main house. Marguerite would have some of his favorite food waiting, and more importantly, there was the girl that he needed to meet. He walked slowly and deliberately back to his campsite and expertly put out the fire, smothering the flames in dirt and damp pine needles. He grabbed his pack and the deer horn and worked his way out of the wood, whistling as he walked out onto the pasture land. He could see the tents still standing and considered making his camp for the remainder of his stay. And as he got closer to the main house, he could hear the horses in the stable and decided to stop there first to check on some of his favorite beings. Edgar took great care to visit each horse, treating them like they were old friends. Some he knew quite well, and others were new to him, but he treated each one with love and respect. He didn't like to think they were out here all alone, and he would often sleep in the stables when he was there, breaking out his drum and playing it lightly for them at night. He knew they were sensitive souls, and he liked them to feel comfortable. He could tell by the demeanor of a few of them that something was going on around the ranch. He wasn't called the horse whisperer around town for nothing, although he personally renounced that title. His grandfather had called it wind-talking, and he had just used that same concept to communicate with any sentient being. He just happened to feel the most comfortable around the equine beings, and that is where he spent his time. He saw Onyx in the furthest stall and made his way over to him. "What's been going on around here, old friend?" he said to the horse as he stroked his muzzle. Onyx just whinnied and moved into Edgar's presence. "Well, I'll be darned," he said. "So you did see something. Well, I'll just have to come down after breakfast and take you for a ride then," he said to the horse, as if he were speaking with anyone else of the human persuasion. Edgar patted Onyx and left the stables to get breakfast. When he arrived at the back door, he was greeted with all the smells of home cooking, and he let himself savor them before he moved into the kitchen. He took off his boots in the mudroom and emerged into the kitchen, padding around in bare feet. The room was empty, and he helped himself to a mug of hot, steaming coffee. It was Marguerite's special blend, and it brought him awake and fully to his senses. As he was reviewing the spread set out on the counter, he reached for a bagel, and then he saw her. Moving towards the kitchen from the living area was quite possibly the most beautiful young girl he had ever seen. Any man would be lucky to have this girl for a wife, he thought, knowing that he wasn't that man, but it couldn't hurt to dream. Moxie entered the kitchen, still in her clothes from the day before, with the large denim jacket over her shoulders. She saw Edgar and just kept moving. Men in any form or presence didn't bother her. She just assumed it was someone working around the ranch. "Good morning," she said sleepily. "My name's Moxie. I'm Diego's friend," she said, picking up a bagel and smothering it with some of Marguerite's homemade vegan cream cheese. As Edgar watched the girl, he had a strange reaction in his stomach. He felt he knew her from somewhere, but that was crazy. And then it hit him as he received a huge download of information from his spirit guides, and then he immediately knew who she was and how she played into the story of Thunder Rose Ranch. No one needed to tell Edgar that what was happening here seemed like science fiction. He knew that the outside observer would think the obvious if told about this place. They would think it was some haunted location that needed a ghost hunter to come and displace otherworldly spirits. But since getting here, he knew, had always known really since he first stepped foot on this land, that it held a magic and purity that was only found in what was called a sacred place. And this was like no other sacred place in that it held its own energy of the divine and would continue to send that energy out to whoever needed to be here to witness what was to occur on this land in the coming months and years. It was almost too much for him to fathom at the moment, and he suddenly realized over his coffee and bagel that he might not be going home to Oklahoma for a long while now. He had a lot of work to do, and so did this girl Moxie and her counterparts. He just wasn't sure exactly how it would all be pieced together. And there were still unfolding mysteries regarding the box and the horrible sounds that they had been hearing coming from the woods. As he drank and ate and chatted with the others who slowly came in for their morning brew, he saw his next steps unfolding before him. He heartily greeted Marguerite by sweeping her off her feet and planting a big kiss on her cheek. He knew that secretly she helped hold this ranch together with her faith and her cooking. He shook Diego's hand and noticed that he had entered from the outside. He also saw a tension between Diego and Amber and couldn't quite place what was going on there. Amber had come into the kitchen looking like she'd been up all night, and he had never seen her so tired and worn out looking for such a young girl. And then Pamela emerged in her true beauty queen style, having to be the last one to enter so all eyes could be on her. And Edgar's eyes certainly were on the aging beauty and his old friend as she sat down next to him, brushing his thigh with hers as she moved onto one of the high kitchen stools around the breakfast counter. The conversation seemed light and somewhat flirtatious, but Edgar, being able to tune into a person's sensitivities, could tell that all was not as it seemed. He knew drama and felt that something beyond Moxie's incident the night before was going on around here. So he decided to do what he always did when he needed clarity and to clear the air between people. "Tonight I'll be hosting a drum journey and honoring ritual," he said, as if everyone there knew exactly what he meant. Pamela and Amber were used to his ways by now and knew this meant they would be sitting outside in the cold by the fire as Edgar drummed and chanted around them. Moxie and Diego had no idea what he was talking about, so Edgar decided to expand and provide just enough to entice Moxie to stay. She was the one he really needed to get to in these rituals. She was the one that had been chosen to be a conduit and had been chosen as her guide. He had been chosen as her guide and protector. A choice that he still wasn't sure he was capable enough to handle. "It's okay, everyone. It'll be good medicine," he said, taking a bite of his bagel and nodding to Moxie, who wasn't quite sure what to make of this man now. Who was he really, she thought to herself. He looks like he could be living out on the range like some sort of wayward character, and he carried himself like that, like he was totally confident of what he was saying. And what was a drum journey and honoring ritual? She didn't have any context and decided to ask more questions. Excuse me, Edgar," she said politely. "How exactly is this supposed to work? Like, what do we do and what am I to expect? I've never heard of a drum journey before." She put on her best innocent eyes and then looked over to see Diego watching her. At that moment, she felt a heat enter her body and she longed to touch him. Of course, she couldn't just reach out across the counter and grab him, but she added this mental note to herself and decided that she may just have to take action. She also wondered what had happened between him and Amber the night before, as Amber certainly did look drained and exhausted. "My girl, we will have so much fun tonight. Just you don't worry, okay? Promise me you'll stay for the ritual. I know there will be something special for you in it, but you just have to wait and find out," he said, actually not knowing how anything was going to play out yet. He didn't consider it lying to her. He just wanted to embellish a little bit to pique her interest. Moxie hadn't considered anything beyond breakfast yet, and she was still trying to figure out the whole Diego and Amber incident. She almost couldn't take it any longer. "Diego, may I see you outside, please?" she said, smiling at him demurely. Diego, caught off guard, stood up and grabbed an extra bagel. "Sure, Moxie. Let me get a coat. I'll meet you out there," he said, as she brushed past him, turning at the door to the outside to look back over her shoulder. "Oh, you won't need that," she said, pointing at the bagel. He had no idea what she was doing, but it sounded a little exciting, so he pushed the bagel in his pocket as he hurried outside. Moxie wasn't there, but he heard her yell from the end of the path, heading out towards the pasture. "Diego, I need to talk to you over here," she said, running towards the tents in the pasture. She didn't know where this sudden need for sex was coming from, but she couldn't help herself any longer. She needed to know Diego as she had never known another man before. What was compelling her to do this, she wasn't sure why or how, but it was happening, and she was tired of holding herself back. She rushed into the tent that had been Diego's and slipped into his sleeping bag. She shimmied out of her clothes and lay there waiting for him, breathing heavily now. What in the world was this girl doing, Diego thought as he ran after her. He saw her duck into his tent, and he wasn't exactly sure what to think. He entered the tent to find her looking up at him from out of his sleeping bag. "Girl, what's going on here?" he said, feeling a little excited. "I just need you, that's all," she said shyly. I don't know what's come over me, but I can't hide my feelings for you any longer." Well, he didn't need a second request, but he wasn't sure exactly how to make this happen. Moxie stood up and let the sleeping bag fall to the ground, revealing all of herself to him. "I'm taking a chance on you, cowboy. You better not break my heart," she said, stepping towards him and standing there in front of him, innocent and unbridled. "Whoa, no one has ever approached me like this," he said, slowly touching her cheek and then moving his hand down to cup her breast as they looked into each other's eyes. "Moxie," Diego said, ready to pledge himself to her. "Just be quiet and kiss me," she said, pulling his lips onto hers. They embraced, and she quickly helped him out of his clothes. They lay down on the sleeping bag, breathing heavily as she took him into her. They moaned and moved together to a rhythm all their own. And when they were done, they lay there spent as she sat on top of him. "What do we do now?" she said, laughing lightly. "Girl," he said, looking up at the most beautiful girl he knew. "If you only knew," he said, trailing off as he moved her off of him and entered her again, kissing her lightly as he ran his hands over her body. This time they finished together and lay there in complete stillness. "I have no idea what came over me," she said, a little embarrassed, "but I'm glad it did." "Promise me you'll stay today," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Promise," she said, kissing him on the cheek. "Now let's get dressed. It's freezing out here." Chapter 8. Drums and Roses. Back at the house, Pamela and Edgar made plans for the evening drum circle. She was very familiar with this process now and knew exactly what Edgar needed in terms of preparation. She didn't quite understand all the nuances of what he did, but she knew she always felt better and more alive after one of his rituals. As they planned around the evening, Moxie and Diego made their way back up to the main house. They stopped at the back gate and looked at each other. "This doesn't change anything, you know," she said, looking away towards the trees. "I'm still obligated to Diamond, and so are you," she said, wistfully wondering how she could free herself from this place, the Pink Lady, and start over again. She had so many questions and little to no answers at this point. She had also no idea what had happened to her the other night, and she was hoping it wouldn't happen again. Diego wasn't ready to hear all of this yet. He didn't know how this act of love-making would change anything either. Maybe it was all just meant to stay the same, he thought. I'm not ready for that kind of relationship right now either. And so they dropped hands and made their way back inside. But the glow that lovemaking brings is evident to those that are schooled in such things, and as the two lovers entered the room, Pamela's sex siren sounded in her mind. Those two have been up to something, she thought, eyeing them both with wondering and amusement. I wonder what, she thought, as she brought her attention back to the planning. Moxie realized she had nothing to wear for another day at the ranch and decided to go back into town to grab a bag and talk to Diamond. She needed some time off, and she thought she had earned it with her faithful service to the Pink Lady over so many years. She felt she needed at least a week, if not longer, and decided to let her talking speak for itself when it came time to face her mentor and employer. I'm going into town to pick up some clothes, Moxie said to the group. Pamela, can I bring back anything for tonight? She wasn't exactly sure what you brought to a drum ceremony, but it was polite to ask anyway, as her grandmother had taught her when she was a little girl. Moxie, you must always respect your elders and your hosts, her abuelita would tell her in broken English. Moxie, only a little girl at the time, didn't really know what this meant, but started to understand it more at Diamond's tutelage, although respecting men that wanted to host her body for hire was something she was sure her grandmother wasn't referring to. Diego couldn't control the sense of happiness that had come over him, and he was ready to get out to the stables and work on his chores. He had a glow about him, Pamela thought, as she eyed him lacing up his work boots. She wanted that glow, too, she thought, with a little envy in her heart. She needed that glow, and this sense of entitlement made her even more certain than ever that she was going to catch Edgar before he left this ranch. If that man doesn't take me in his arms and confess his deep, unending love for me, she thought, then this is his last season on my ranch. There, that was it. She had made a vow to herself, and she was going to keep it. Amber sauntered back into the kitchen, looking somewhat better than before after showering and putting on fresh makeup and clothes. She had missed the afterglow of love between Diego and Moxie, as she still had her heart set on taking Diego for herself. Amber, I need to speak with you when I'm done here, Pamela said, Pamela eyed Amber, ready to attack about the condom, but knowing she had to stay calm and centered as her life coach kept trying to instill in her. Amber had no idea what her mother wanted, and could only imagine it was some speech again about needing to be a better hostess. She picked up a bagel and slathered it with Marguerite's homemade jam. She took a bite and caught Edgar watching her. He was always perplexed by this girl and not quite sure how to approach her. I have a job for you tonight, young lady, he said, holding up his hand and showing her a drumstick. You're going to help me drum. But I don't know anything about drumming, she said, wondering where he could have gotten this idea from. Your mother tells me you were quite the drummer in your school marching band and parade last year, he said, a little amused. I only took that band class because Mom made me, she said, wrinkling her nose at the thought of herself in that stupid band uniform they had made her wear. Her band teacher had made a few comments about her percussion skills, but she hadn't taken him seriously. Then after the school parade and homecoming dance, she quit the band to pursue other interests, namely muscle-bound jocks, and her own interest in being taken to bed by one. She didn't have time for band practice when she had to follow Billy Worthington around to get his attention. And it had been working, too, until his then-girlfriend had found out and had done everything she could to keep Amber away from him. You don't have to be a professional drummer, Edgar said. You just need to hold a beat for me. I have some other things I need to do during this ritual, and it would be a big help to your little one. What do you say? Can you help an old man out? He said, clearly laying on the sympathy game to try and win her over. Okay, I'll do it, she said dejectedly. This is an honor, Amber, and I ask that you treat it as such, he said, pushing his stool back from the counter and rising up. To Amber, he looked like a scary old Indian, and she wondered what else was going to happen tonight. She knew that her mom secretly liked Edgar, but she couldn't imagine him calling her stepdaughter. If she had her way, he would be gone and never come back again. You just wait, Edgar Whitetail, she thought to herself. I'm going to make sure you and my mom never connect. As Edgar and Amber were eyeing each other, Moxie made ready to head into town. Moxie, can I come with you? Amber said, hoping she should get off the ranch long enough to pull herself back together for tonight, and hoping she could escape this talk with her mother. Not so fast, young lady, Pamela said, walking up behind her. Let's have that talk first, and then we'll decide whether you're going anywhere or not. Meet me in the library, and no excuses. Amber knew her mom meant business, so she huffed as she moved out of the kitchen to the library. What could she want now, Amber thought, with absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. Pamela had spent most of the early morning trying to practice how to deliver this message. She prayed for guidance, knowing that in these times of strife she needed God the most. Lord, help me be a good mother, she prayed silently, as she positioned herself in a chair inside the library. She expected tears and yelling, and the library was one of the most soundproof areas of the house. She still wanted her dignity and the respect of her guests, and definitely didn't want them hearing a conversation about teenage sex. She knew Amber was 19 and living at home for free right now, She wanted what was best for her daughter, but she knew that it was also Amber's decision now to stay or leave Thunder Rose, and Pamela had good reason to want her daughter to stay with her. She was lonely and scared, and if Edgar couldn't figure out what was happening here, then she would be alone at Thunder Rose with this mystery still unsolved, and that terrified her. Pamela was sitting quietly in a wing-back chair, covered in a fabric of horses and riders, one of the few things she had kept from the divorce. She knew she needed to be gentle yet firm with Amber. As her daughter entered the room, Pamela's heart softened a little bit to see her daughter looking so young and fragile. "Amber, please sit down," she said, gesturing towards the other wing-back chair across from her. "Mom," Amber wanted this to be over and fast. I know I'm not being a very good hostess, but it's because Moxie is trying to take Diego away from me." There, she had said it, and her mother would simply have to deal with the fact that she liked Diego. "That's what I want to talk to you about," Pamela said, relieved that Amber had brought it up first. "I found something of yours last night, and I wanted to share that something with you. Amber, first, no man is going to respect a girl who tries to catch him. It just doesn't work that way, hun." Pamela wanted her daughter to see that it was not okay in the Cartwright household for its ladies to be the one to go after the man, although her mind quickly went to Edgar, and she brushed that thought away. "Amber, of course I want you to be safe, but please promise me you'll leave Diego out of this. He's not for you, Amber. I think he has his eye on Moxie, and that's why I want you to be careful. Moxie's a smart girl, and she's bound to catch on, hun. Just promise me you'll stay out of this." "Or what?" Amber's blood was boiling now. She didn't want to be told by her mother who she could and couldn't like. She wanted Diego, or maybe she just thought she did. Heck, her mother was making her so confused she couldn't think straight. "Mom, I've got to get out of here. You're confusing me. Of course Diego doesn't like Moxie. I've been watching them, and they are definitely not right for each other. I almost had him last night, and you're not going to stop me." She was crying now and up, moving towards the door to the hallway. "I'm going to town with Moxie," she said, thinking she could escape Pamela, which was a mistake. "Come back here, Amber," Pamela said, trying to soften her tone. "Look, Diego is staying here to work while Moxie goes into town. Stay here with me. If he really likes you, he'll come to you, and you'll see by the look in his eyes. Look, hon, I know when a man wants a woman, and I just don't see that between you two, but you'll need to see that for yourself, Amber." "Fine," Amber said as her mind flashed to last night and the letdown by the fire. She just needed to get him alone again, she thought. Maybe they could talk. "Okay, Mom, I'll do as you ask. But don't push me, okay? I have my limits, too," she said, backing out of the room and into the hallway. Well, that seemed almost pointless, Pamela thought to herself as she rose from the chair and went to look out the window. She could see down to the parking area, and she had a clear view of Moxie and Diego standing together at Moxie's car. There was no doubt in Pamela's mind that those two were sleeping together. Now to get Amber to see for herself. But Pamela didn't have time to think about it any further as a blood-curdling screech went up from the wood. She shook her head and covered her ears. "Go away, you demons! Go away and leave me alone!" she said out loud as she sank back down into the chair. Edgar heard it clearly and was up and out the back door, making a quick run towards the entrance to the wood. Something stopped him right at the entrance, and it was as if he couldn't move. He didn't like this at all, he thought. This wasn't what he thought, and didn't seem to have anything to do with the loving energy he felt earlier. This was much more sinister and complex, and he realized he needed to get busy now. No holding back. There was a force here he couldn't handle, and he wanted to better understand it, but he was going to need to figure out fast. He grabbed his medicine bag and pulled out a large cross made of gold. He thrust the cross up into the air, and in a bold and determined voice he asked God to cast out whatever spirits were inhabiting these woods. He almost lost his balance as he fought to stay upright and finish his prayer. And as he concluded calling in God and holy angels and helping spirits, he felt the numbness wear off, and his body was able to move forward again. His mind calmed, and he was finally able to see this for what it was. A battle between good and evil. The evil would never win, he thought. Good will always prevail, and he would be here with the girl when the battle took place. Soon everyone would see that there was no way the darkness would ever prevail. As he thought about the girl, a strong scent of roses filled the air. He looked around, but he didn't see anyone or anything around that could be causing this stronger, fragrant, and overwhelmingly beautiful scent.